There's a strange paradox in the Linux world. On one side, you have operating systems that proudly advertise how easy they are. It just works. Perfect for beginners. Switch from Windows in minutes. And on the other side, you have distributions that almost seem to do the opposite. They don't simplify everything. They don't hide complexity. They don't hold your hand. In fact, sometimes they feel intentionally difficult. And that raises a serious question. Why would any operating system refuse to be user-friendly? At first glance, it sounds absurd. In a world where technology companies spend billions making interfaces more intuitive, more minimal, more accessible, why would a group of developers design something that feels harder to use? Why would they choose documentation over wizards, configuration files over graphical menus, a blinking terminal cursor instead of a colorful control panel? The answer is not laziness, it's not arrogance. And it's definitely not because they don't know how to build something easier. The answer is philosophy. To understand why some Linux distributions refuse to be user-friendly, you first have to understand what Linux actually is. Linux is not a product in the way Windows or macOS is a product. It's a kernel, the core component that talks to your hardware. Everything else around it, from the desktop environment to the installer to the package manager, is built by communities and organizations with their own goals, values, and priorities. And those priorities are not always centered around convenience. Some distributions are built around stability, some around security, some around minimalism, some around education, some around total user control. And in many of those cases, user-friendly is not the highest goal. Take control, for example. Many advanced Linux distributions are built around the idea that the user should have complete control over their system. Not partial control, not curated control, complete control. That means you decide what gets installed. You decide what services run. You decide how the system boots. You decide how software is compiled. You decide how updates are handled. But control and convenience often move in opposite directions. When a system makes decisions for you, it becomes easier. When a system asks you to make those decisions yourself, it becomes harder. User-friendly systems abstract complexity away. Control-oriented systems expose complexity. And that exposure is intentional. Consider a distribution like Arch Linux. It doesn't ship with a pre-configured desktop. It doesn't give you a heavily guided installer with friendly buttons and automatic partitioning by default. It gives you documentation. It gives you a command line. It gives you a base system. And then it says, build what you want. To someone coming from Windows or macOS, that feels hostile. Why not just install everything automatically? Why not detect the hardware and configure it for the user? Why not provide a recommended setup? Because the philosophy behind such systems is that you should understand what you're installing. You should know what packages are on your machine. You should know why they're there. You should know how your bootloader works. You should know how your network stack is configured. This approach treats the user not as a consumer but as an operator. There's a belief within parts of the Linux community that convenience can create ignorance. And ignorance in computing can be dangerous. When you don't know how your system works, you can't fix it when it breaks. You can't secure it properly. You can't optimize it for your needs. So instead of shielding you from complexity, these distributions introduce you to it. Another reason some distros refuse to be user-friendly is transparency. In highly polished operating systems, a lot happens behind the scenes. Background services run silently. Configuration is hidden in graphical interfaces. Logs are buried. System behavior is abstracted. In contrast, more difficult Linux distributions expose everything. Configuration files are plain text, logs are readable, system services are explicitly managed. If something fails, you see the error. That can feel overwhelming. But it also means nothing is hidden. This transparency builds trust. You can audit what your system is doing. You can trace problems to their source. You can modify behavior precisely. You're not clicking through vague options like optimize performance or reset settings. You're editing exact parameters. Of course, this requires learning. And learning requires effort. And effort is the opposite of frictionless user experience. Then there's minimalism. Some Linux distributions intentionally ship with almost nothing. No pre-installed desktop environment. No Office suite. No browser. No media player. Just the essentials. Why? Because every pre-installed package is an opinion. Every default application assumes what the user wants. Minimalist distributions reject assumptions. They assume nothing about your workflow. They don't presume you want GNOME over KDE, or Firefox over Chromium, or Pulse Audio over Pipewire. They let you decide. But again, that freedom comes at a cost. A new user must research, choose, and install everything manually. That's not user-friendly in the traditional sense. It's user-empowering. Security is another factor. In security-focused distributions like Qubes OS or hardened Gentoo setups, usability often takes a backseat to isolation and protection. You might have to deal with compartmentalized applications. You might need to understand virtual machines. You might encounter restrictions that prevent simple tasks from working smoothly. From a convenience perspective, that's annoying. From a security perspective, it's necessary. When security is the priority, friction is sometimes deliberate. The system makes risky behavior harder. It forces separation between tasks. It refuses to blur boundaries for the sake of ease, and that can feel unfriendly. Then there's the educational aspect. Some distributions act almost like textbooks. They're not trying to be easy. They're trying to teach. Gentoo, for instance, requires compiling software from source, configuring USE flags, understanding dependencies at a deep level. Linux from scratch takes this even further, guiding users through building an entire system manually. These are not meant for casual users. They're meant for people who want to understand Linux at its core. If you make everything automatic, you remove the learning process. If you automate compilation, dependency resolution, and optimization entirely, the user never sees how the pieces fit together. By refusing to be user-friendly, these systems preserve complexity as an educational tool. There's also a cultural dimension. Linux was born in a hacker culture, and hacker here doesn't mean criminal. It means tinkerer, explorer, builder. Early Linux users were often developers, engineers, and hobbyists who enjoyed solving problems. Complexity wasn't a barrier. It was a challenge. In that culture, documentation is valued. Community forums are valued. Reading manuals is normal. The expectation is not that the system adapts entirely to you, but that you adapt to the system and learn how it works. That mindset still influences certain distributions today. And then there's the issue of scope. User-friendly systems require massive resources. Designing intuitive interfaces, conducting usability testing, maintaining graphical tools, translating documentation into multiple languages, supporting countless hardware combinations, all of this takes time and money. Many Linux distributions are maintained by small volunteer teams. They don't have the budget of Microsoft or Apple, so they prioritize core functionality over polished user experience. They focus on making the system stable, efficient, and flexible rather than visually friendly. Graphical configuration tools are expensive to build and maintain. Command line tools are simpler, more universal, and easier to document, so smaller teams often choose the latter. That's not a rejection of users. It's a realistic allocation of limited resources. Another overlooked reason is consistency. Graphical interfaces change. Design trends evolve. But text configuration files remain stable. Command line tools remain scriptable. For advanced users and system administrators, this consistency is more important than aesthetic ease. A server running Debian or Arch in a data center doesn't need a friendly GUI. It needs predictability. It needs clear configuration. It needs tools that behave the same way over SSH as they do locally. So some distributions optimize for that environment. And when desktop users encounter them, they feel harsh or unfriendly because they weren't primarily designed for that audience. There's also the idea of responsibility. In highly automated systems, users often blame the OS when something goes wrong. In more manual systems, users take responsibility for their configuration choices. If you installed a conflicting package, you resolve it. If you edited a configuration file incorrectly, you fix it. This fosters a different relationship between user and system. It's less consumer-oriented and more collaborative. And that collaboration can be empowering. Now, none of this means that user-friendly distributions are inferior. Distros like Ubuntu, Linux Mint, and Fedora Workstation play a critical role in making Linux accessible to millions. They lower the barrier to entry. They provide sensible defaults. They prioritize convenience. But the existence of those distros doesn't invalidate the philosophy of the others. In fact, the diversity is one of Linux's greatest strengths. Some people want an appliance. Some people want a toolkit. An appliance hides complexity. You plug it in and it works. A toolkit exposes complexity. You assemble what you need. Neither approach is objectively better. They serve different audiences. However, there's another subtle reason some distros resist user-friendliness: avoiding bloat. When you design for ease, you often add layers, helper daemons, abstraction frameworks, compatibility shims, auto-detection services, background indexing tools. These layers consume resources. They increase system complexity internally, even if they reduce it externally. Minimalist distributions often strip these layers away. They aim for lean performance, fewer background services, fewer default packages, less RAM usage, faster boot times. The trade-off? You configure more manually. And then there's ideological purity. Certain distributions adhere strictly to free software principles. They refuse to include proprietary drivers or firmware by default. That can mean hardware doesn't work out of the box. Wi-Fi might not function immediately. Graphics acceleration might require extra steps. From a mainstream perspective, that's terrible user experience. From a free software perspective, it's ethical consistency. The distribution is saying, we will not compromise our values for convenience. That's not a technical decision. It's a philosophical one. Another dimension is long-term maintainability. Automated configuration tools can become outdated quickly. GU is tied to specific libraries, can break when dependencies change. But text-based configuration and modular systems tend to age more gracefully. By keeping things simple at the core, even if they appear complex to users, some distributions ensure they can be maintained for decades. Look at Debian. Its stability isn't built on flashy tools. It's built on careful package management, conservative updates, and a strong policy framework. User-friendliness often implies rapid iteration and frequent design changes. Stability-focused distributions avoid that. There's also a psychological element. When a system is too easy, some users feel disconnected from it. They don't feel ownership. They don't understand it. They can't customize it deeply. When you build your own system from scratch, even if it takes hours, you develop attachment. You understand every component. You know why it behaves the way it does. That sense of ownership is powerful. Some distros preserve that experience intentionally. And yet, we should acknowledge something important. What counts as user-friendly depends on the user. For a beginner, a terminal-based installer is terrifying. For a seasoned Linux administrator, a GUI-only configuration tool can feel limiting and frustrating. User-friendliness is relative. If you've spent years working in the command line, typing a few commands might be faster and more intuitive than navigating nested menus. If you manage servers remotely, a lightweight system without graphical overhead is more practical. So when someone says a distro refuses to be user-friendly, what they often mean is that it refuses to cater to beginners. But that doesn't mean it's unfriendly to everyone. In fact, for its target audience, it may be perfectly optimized. There's also the concept of trust in the user. Mainstream operating systems often assume the user will make mistakes. So they restrict access, they hide system files. They require elevated permissions. They warn repeatedly before allowing changes. Linux distributions, especially advanced ones, often assume competence. They give you root access. They let you modify anything. They don't block you from breaking your system. That freedom can be dangerous. But it's also respectful. It says, you are capable. And if you're not yet capable, you can become capable. In many ways, the refusal to be user-friendly is a refusal to underestimate the user. It's an invitation to grow. Now, does that mean all difficulty is justified? No. Some distros genuinely suffer from poor documentation, inconsistent design, or neglected tooling. Not every rough edge is philosophical. Sometimes it's just lack of polish. But in many cases, what appears as stubborn complexity is actually intentional design. There's also an evolutionary aspect. Over time, features that start in advanced distros often trickle down into user-friendly ones. Rolling releases, atomic updates, containerized applications, Wayland sessions. Many innovations were first adopted by technically inclined communities before becoming mainstream. Those communities serve as experimental labs. They tolerate complexity in exchange for innovation. They test new paradigms. They refine workflows. If every distro prioritized ease above all else, experimentation would slow down. By refusing to smooth every edge, some distributions preserve space for innovation. And then there's the matter of expectations. If you approach a minimalist or advanced Linux distribution expecting it to behave like Windows, you will be frustrated. But if you approach it expecting to learn and customize, the experience changes completely. The friction becomes part of the journey. You don't just install software, you understand dependencies. You don't just update the system, you read changelogs. You don't just fix errors, you debug them. That process builds skill. In a world increasingly dominated by sealed ecosystems and curated experiences, there's something radical about an operating system that says, here are the tools. Now build your environment. It's not always comfortable, it's not always smooth, but it's empowering. Ultimately, the reason some Linux distros refuse to be user-friendly is because they're optimizing for something else. They're optimizing for control, for transparency, for minimalism, for security, for education, for philosophical consistency, for performance, for innovation, for long-term stability, for user empowerment. User-friendliness is one value among many. It is not the only value. And in the Linux ecosystem, diversity of values is not a flaw. It's a feature. If every distribution tried to be the most beginner-friendly, Linux would lose part of its identity. It would become more homogeneous, more centralized, more predictable. Instead, it remains a spectrum. At one end, you have polished, accessible systems designed to welcome newcomers. At the other end, you have raw, customizable frameworks that demand engagement. Both ends matter. Because sometimes refusing to be user-friendly isn't about rejecting users. It's about respecting them enough to let them see how things really work.